Hi, welcome everyone to this seminar about two of the greatest estates in the Douro, Quinta de Roriz and Quinta do Vesuvio. Starting us off today is Greg Van Wagner, the creator of SommGeo. He'll be taking us on a short tour of the Douro Valley. The full virtual wine trip is currently free for all to view on SommFoundation.com. If you can't find it there, there's also a link to it in the reminder email you received from Zoom yesterday. After Greg, we'll hear from fourth generation port producers Rupert and Charles Symington, who are the CEO and head winemaker at Symington Family Estates. A quick note for those of you who have joined us through SommFoundation, you should all have a set of samples in front of you. Later today, Lynn will be sending around a link to a 30-question quiz on this seminar. Please remember to take that quiz for an opportunity to win one of 2 spots on a trip to the Douro with Symington Family Estates next year. One last thing before I hand off to Greg. Please direct all questions to the Q&A section rather than the chat. Rupert and Charles will be answering them at the end of the seminar, and it'll be far easier to find them all in that Q&A section. Please do feel free to use the chat to say hi to colleagues from around the country. You can do that by selecting the option to send messages to all guests and panelists in the little drop down above your chat box. Thank you, and Greg, over to you.
Well, welcome everyone. It's a pleasure to be here and get to taste these wines. I'm really excited to see a great selection and have some great vintage port, which I wish I got to drink more often. We'll be traveling through the Douro Valley in northern Portugal. And there's never been a better time to drink Portuguese wine. One of my favorite parts of the Portuguese wine scene is how they showcase their selection of hundreds of indigenous varieties, which is really refreshing in today's world where so many regions are relying on the same group of international grapes. The Douro Valley, carved of course by the Douro River, has really all these amazing hillsides and is the largest mountain viticulture region in the world. And now if you haven't been to the Douro, I highly recommend moving it to the top of your list for when you can. Combines great food and wine and a chance to see both unique production techniques in port as well as vineyards really unlike anything you'll find anywhere else in the wine world. And so now we'll start the trip in Porto. Now this is the population base of northern Portugal and plays a huge role in the Douro Valley wine scene. The suburb of Via Nova de Gaia, traditionally home to the port lodges and well, nowadays as well, for aging. We'll head up the river. The Serra do Marão, they play a huge role in the climate of the Douro as they block a lot of the impact of the Atlantic Ocean. The Atlantic Ocean creates cooler and rainier conditions, think like Vinho Verde. But the Serra do Marão, they rise up past 1,400 meters or about 4,600 feet to block a lot of that influence. Now through the 3 subzones, Baixo Corgo, fittingly is the rainier of the 3, and you can see a big difference in the color of the vegetation. And you'll really see that as we move up the Cima Corga. Upriver to the Cima Corga, this really represents the heart of the Douro Valley. With many top estates and the greatest amount of land under vine. Here's Pinhal, one of the main towns up in the valley itself. Now you can see there's so many different aspects of vineyards to work with. So they all receive varying amounts of sun and heat. So there's a lot of vineyard selection depending on whether you're making port or red wine. Now up to the Douro Superior. We have really the most severely continental climate of the 3 subregions. And you can see Quinta do Vesuvio here, but we'll be coming back to that estate shortly. First, we'll head over to Quinta de Roriz in the Cima Corga. So this is on the left bank of the Douro with its vineyards planted mostly towards the northern end of the compass. And you can see a selection of different planting techniques with these great terraces carved into the hillsides here. But there's also some planted directly up and down the slope, which there's some possible benefits for sun exposure with that technique, but I'd love to hear more on that from Rupert and Charles. And some great photos of the vineyards and winery, really trying to do the best to convey just how beautiful and extreme the vineyards of the Douro Valley are, but you're really gonna have to see it in person. And 2 folks are actually gonna have the opportunity to go on the harvest trip, which will be incredible. Now up into Douro Superior, Quinta do Vesuvio, one of the larger estates and situated on prime vineyard land. Again, just stunning vineyards here, as you can imagine, a great deal more difficult to work than flatland vines. Most everything has to be done by hand, and it's certainly arduous, but work that's worth it when you see the final result. I hope you enjoyed the quick tour. We've got a stellar lineup today of speakers and wines. So now off to the two gentlemen in Portugal.
Well, hi everybody. I hope you can hear me. Greg's connection was pretty good, so hopefully ours is as good as his is. I'd just like to welcome you to a wonderful Douro Terroir seminar, which we're going to present using the wines of Quinta de Roriz and Quinta do Vesuvio. Quinta de Roriz being a Suma Corvo property, and the Quinta de Vesuvio being a Douro Superior property. The Douro is probably the most well-known wine region of Portugal through its long history making port. Port was originally a wine region that was started off in 1756, making it one of the oldest wine regions in the world. Today, the region has about 40,000 hectares of vineyard, making it the largest area of mountain vineyard in the world. Since 82, there's been a second demarcation known as Douro. We call it Douro DOC. And so there are two appellations running in parallel, port and dry wines. I'd like to tell you a bit about Symington Family Estates itself. The family company that Charles and I work for has been in existence since 1882, when our great-grandfather, Andrew James Symington, moved from Scotland to the Douro, or Porto and the Douro. Over many, many generations, Charles and I are the fourth generation. We now have a fifth generation working in the business. We now have 9 family members between the fourth and fifth generations. And over that period of time, we've built up, we've moved downstream. We started off really as wine merchants, and we then moved more into wine making, and over another generation we moved into wine growing. So we've sort of moved downstream in the wine process. We're now probably the largest quality wine producer in the region. We're immensely proud of that evolution. We were responsible for 1 in 3 bottles of really good port sold worldwide each year, and we have over 1,000 hectares of vineyard, prime vineyard up in the Douro. We have 26 estates and 8 wineries in operation in the Douro, which makes us, very, very sort of important in the, not only in the vineyard ownership, but also in quality winemaking. We have also moved to sustainable. Sorry. We've moved heavily into sustainability, and we became a B Corporation in 2019. This is a quality standard we're immensely proud of, that it basically gives a level of responsibility to the environment, to our staff, and to our trading partners. So I'm going to hand over to Charles to talk about some of the geography of the region and some of the things that make the Douro special in terms of its geography and geology.
Well, hi to everybody. Good morning in the US. It's the end of the day here at the moment, and very glad to be talking to you about the Douro Valley. And as Rupert said, the demarcated port wine region is the oldest demarcated wine region in the world. And it's a region that has 3 sub-regions. It's the most westerly one, known as the Baixo Córrego. The central area is known as the Cima Córrego, and the eastern part of the Douro is known as the Douro Superior. Now, these 3 areas have fairly different characteristics. Basically, as you go from west to east, it becomes drier and hotter. The most easterly sub-region, the Douro Superior, is on the front, finishes on the frontier with Spain, at a point in which the Douro River then goes along the border with Spain for about 60 kilometers. And the Douro, like Bordeaux, has 2 main areas that influence its climate, which is the Mediterranean on the one side and the Atlantic on the other. And these 2 different sort of climates are what make the vintages in the Douro so varied from one year to another. So basically, the Douro, the rain that we get in the Douro is mainly coming off the Atlantic when we get southwest winds, which come round behind the Serra do Marão, the Serras mountains. The Marão mountainside. So the Marão mountainside has around 1,000 meters in altitude and is a big barrier to the Atlantic climate. But when the wind swings to southwest, that brings us rain. And basically, from the most westerly areas of the Douro, the Baixo Córrego, would expect to get about 800 millimeters a year. The most easterly areas in the Douro Superior would be getting in the region of about 450 millimeters. So quite a significant difference, which brings about many differences in yields, particularly, but obviously the type of plantings that people will do in different areas will vary with the rainfall. Now, in terms of temperature, the situation is quite similar, getting hotter as you go from the Baixo Córrego east to the Douro Superior. Temperatures in the Douro will often go below 0 in winter, and in the summer it's not unusual to be going over 40 degrees C, particularly in the Douro Superior. So we have quite a big amplitude of temperatures. We have quite extreme temperature, particularly in the summer. We can have many consecutive days of heat temperatures above 40 degrees C. So quite challenging conditions for the Douro, between the geography, the terrain, the mountainside, the extremes of temperature, the low rainfall, generally speaking, which all brings about quite labor-intensive work. It's hard to mechanize much of the work in the vineyard in the Douro, and therefore, between having a considerable high number of hours per hectare to produce grapes and the very low yields that we experience, between the combination of these 2 things, we have probably the most expensive grapes in the world, somewhere in the region of about 70 cents per kilo would be sort of an average figure for the region. Yields in the Baixo Córrego would be normally somewhere around 5 tons per hectare, and in the Douro Superior, more like 3 tons per hectare. So we're looking at figures which are half of what you'd expect in Europe, and probably about a quarter of the expected yield worldwide. The average worldwide yield of grapes is about 12 tons per kilo. So quite challenging conditions. We certainly benefit, however, from fantastic quality of grapes with fantastic concentration. And so, you know, the effort's definitely worth it, but it's certainly challenging at the best of times. I think I'll pass in that case over to my cousin Rupert, who's going to talk about soils next.
Well, the soil composition of the Douro has a quite porous and well-drained layer of schistous rock lying over granite. Schist is a metamorphous rock. Probably started off life as a sedimentary mud that was then metamorphosed into a layered sort of slate-like rock. All over the main Douro Valley, you get this schist, and it's basically in the vineyards, it looks like a sort of yellow-brown shale-like rock. It's been broken up into smaller pieces, and in some places it's been broken down into dust. Schist is useful because it does allow winter rainfall. We get most of our rainfall between October and April, and most of that rainfall can basically filter through the broken up schist, and it basically hits the granite where it gets trapped. Granite is not porous, and most of the vines in the Douro basically feed off water reserves that are down in the granite, some sort of 20 feet down underground, and that's useful because during summer months there is no rainfall typically, and the vines have to feed off those water reserves deep down. The advantage of having vines feed deep down is that they get sort of interesting subsoils with different mineral contents, and we have really interesting, very mineral wines coming out of the Douro, and the mineral content varies depending where you are in the Douro. So you can grow, vineyards grow with a lot of different characters across different regions of the Douro. Makes it a very fun place to make wine, because you really don't know what you're getting, and your neighbor can have a totally different soil content or mineral content from your own vineyard. The Douro is essentially an acidic region, quite low pH. The acidity does drop as you go upriver, so you've got a slightly lower pH in the Cima Corvo compared to the Douro Superior. The pH basically it declines as you go down the Douro, from Douro Superior to the Cima Corvo. And that means that you're going to get typically redder fruit flavors in the Cima Corvo, and some sort of more blue forest fruits in the Douro Superior. I just mentioned, Charles mentioned the yields. We work in various different units. Probably at Vesuvio, we're probably getting something like 1.3 kilos per vine. That's to give you an idea of how much weight is coming off each vine. I'll hand back to Charles, talk a little bit about the vine, sort of solar exposures, and then the vine varietals of the Douro.
Okay, well, viticulture in the Douro is certainly an exciting thing to be involved in. And it is amazing how much difference there is going from west to east, and also within a property. So once you're into a property like Roriz or Vesuvio, you have within that property vineyards planted at significantly different altitudes. At Vesuvio, the river's at about 100 meters above sea level, and the top of the property is just over 400 meters above sea level. So we have about 300 meters in altitude difference in our vineyards at that property, which is a very significant difference. But also within that, we also have, although the property is predominantly facing north, because the vineyards are carved out of the curves in the hillside, it is quite usual in the Douro for a block to have 3 different facings. So you could easily have an east, north, and west facing block of vineyard carved out of basically the contours of the mountain. So between the altitude, the different exposures, and then perhaps more importantly, the different varieties and where they're planted and how they're planted. So we have sort of 4 favoured grape varieties that we plant in our properties, which are Touriga Nacional, Touriga Franca, Quinta Barroca, and Quinta Roriz. So those 4 varieties are the predominant varieties in our properties, probably making up, I'd say, at least 80% of most of them. And the different varieties will enjoy different conditions. The Touriga Franca, for instance, is a variety which enjoys heat. It enjoys being near the river, down sort of low-level vineyards, blocks facing often west or south. Whereas the Touriga Nacional is a variety which can suffer more with heat stress, so that you'd be looking often to be planting east-facing, north-facing, and at higher levels. Barrocas and Roriz is actually a variety that's very resilient and it's actually very adaptable. It works really in both situations, high and low altitude and different exposures. They're a very, very useful variety in many ways. Barroca also quite heat sensitive and follows a similar logic to the Touriga Nacional. Then apart from that, there are a couple of other varieties that are often used in the Douro, which are Quinta Amarela and Quinta Gal. And then more recently, we've been planting Alicante Boucher and a variety called Suzanne. These 2 varieties have always existed in the Douro. They're quite apparent in the field blends of old vineyards that we have. But the monovarietal plantings of Alicante and Suzanne is something that we've started to do more recently. The Alicante is an early ripening variety, very resistant to heat, has fantastic colour, and is a variety that is actually relatively new to us as a monovarietal, but actually performing very nicely. The Suzanne has exceptional colour and tremendous acidity. It's a variety that's used in blending ports and very useful, particularly in very hot years. So I think just one of the things that's interesting to mention is that although these different varieties have favoured locations, we do look to, if you like, hedge our bets. So we will be planting some Nacional in hotter locations, south-facing, lower down, and vice versa, some Franca. So in different years, as I mentioned earlier, the Douro can have quite varied vintages. Some vintages can be cold, some vintages are very hot, some are very dry, some are quite wet. So to allow for producing wines of very high quality in any one year, we will spread these different varieties across the mountainside to ensure that in any one year we are able to produce maximum quality wines. So there is always an element of risk management in farming, and we certainly do the same in our vineyards here in the Douro. So just to talk a little bit now about the characteristics of some of these different varieties. And I think really the main 2 are Touriga Nacional and Touriga Franca. The Touriga Nacional is a variety that has great freshness, good acidity, good structure and colour. It's a small bunch, small berries, tends to be relatively early ripening. In fact, all of the varieties in the Douro are short-cycled varieties, and therefore are fairly early ripening relative to, for instance, Cabernet Sauvignon. You'd be picking Cabernet Sauvignon probably a month after the last variety we normally pick, which is to be the Franca. And the first would normally be Quinta Douro. So we're looking at very short cycle varieties. The Trigo Nacional is very aromatic. It tends to be quite spicy. It's also got some quite resiny aromas coming through, often similar to rock rose, very specific aroma. The Trigo Franca is far more floral. It's a variety that is softer, the tannins, doesn't have such good acidity perhaps as the Nacional, but it combines the Franca and the Nacional, as we'll be talking about when we come to the wines. The Nacional and the Franca are really the Cabernet and the Merlot of the Douro, and they combine to create complexity. They complement each other, and therefore are in fact the two mainstays of the Douro today. And I think now I'll just pass over to Rupert. I forgot to mention that to improve our planting and to achieve the best results, we use infrared thermal imaging of our vineyards done by drones, and we use the information that we get from that to assess vigor, and by assessing vigor we can improve the way we plant. We can assess which parcels will be ripening first. As the less vigorous vineyards are, the quicker they tend to ripen. This is obviously a rule of thumb, but it will it definitely is directly related to the time of picking. And so with this information, we can also manage our fertilizing in winter to try and improve the homogeneity of our vineyards. So it's a very powerful tool used really all throughout the year, particularly at the vintage. Rupert is now going to talk a little bit about the differences of port winemaking and table winemaking.
So we've got, it's a fascinating thing. We're looking at two different estates. We're going to be looking at two different estates. Quinta do Vesuvio, way up high in the eastern Douro, the Douro Superior, and Quinta do Roriz in the Cima Corvo. But we're also going to be looking at two different styles of wine from those two estates. Port being the original wine of the Douro. There are lots of different stories as to how port began, but the one I like best is that when the original pioneers came from looking for wines, Britain back in the 1600s was a huge market for wine. Britain didn't make any of its own wine, so it went basically buying most of its produce from France and Germany. When Britain went to war with France, but at that period, merchants basically went and explored the coasts of Spain and Portugal looking for alternative sources of wine, because there was a very heavy tax put on French wine because of the political situation. As merchants went further away, wine had to travel further to get back to Britain, and quite often wines would re-ferment or turn to vinegar on the journey back from Spain and Portugal. And merchants had this idea of adding brandy, this was spirit, to the wines, and this helped stop this re-fermentation. And this gave rise to what we know today as fortified wines, where wines were strengthened to help them basically travel back to Britain. The most famous examples today are port, sherry, and Madeira, probably, the wines which were all probably discovered at an early stage in this sort of quest for new places to find wine that with lower taxes. Port probably started life as a dry wine. The fact that port has a higher sugar level naturally, port grapes do have tend to have they tend to be sweeter, and the trouble with making wines that are sweeter is that you do risk a secondary fermentation. So port started life probably as a wine that was fermented dry, but quite often the fermentation would stick, what's called a stuck fermentation, where not all the sugar is fermented into alcohol, and that would risk then a second fermentation happening in the barrel. So the winemaking difference between port and dry Douro DOC today is largely the addition of brandy. Today, rather than add the brandy after the fermentation, now we add it during the fermentation. And you probably all know how port is made, but we let about half the natural sugar ferment into alcohol, and then we add brandy at 77% alcohol by volume in the proportion of 1 part brandy to 4 parts fermenting must. And that ends up with, it makes, if you add 77%, 1 part of 77% to 4 parts at about 13%, you get, sorry, at 7%, then you get about a wine with about 19% potential alcohol. We tend to add then the brandy when the grapes are picked at a Beaumet of about 13. We let the fermentation run till about half the sugar, so the wines are about 6.5% when we add the brandy. Douro DOC is completely different. We let the fermentation run its full course. The fermentation takes much longer, and the difference with Douro DOC and port, the other difference is, whereas port generally only spends about 48 hours on the skins, at which point we run off the juice off the skins and add the brandy, and there's no further opportunity to extract color and flavor. With Douro DOCs, we are doing it in the classic, we're leaving the wines on the skin for the full fermentation period, and that fermentation takes a lot longer, maybe 7 to 10 days minimum, and compared to port, which is just 48 hours. So this makes obviously winemaking quite challenging to both for port, in order to try and extract all the color and flavor in just 48 hours. We use a fairly sort of aggressive maceration. Traditionally, it was done by foot treading, which was basically grapes were basically tipped into an open stone tank. They were then manually or foot trodden. People jumped in the tank, and for 3 hours there would be a sort of a stomping of the grapes, and then the working of the lagar would have to be by hand, by punching down the cap until about half the sugar had turned to alcohol, and then brandy would be run off, brandy would be added, and that's still the way we make wine today at Quinta Vesuvio. Unfortunately, because of COVID, we couldn't do it that way last year, but we have made wine that's been made continuously by the same method, foot treading at Vesuvio, since the Quinta was first laid out. Douro DOC production is done typically in closed fermenting tanks. Stainless steel is our favored vessel, and very similar to winemaking in other regions. One of the problems of the Douro is, though, the very high sugar levels does make winemaking quite challenging, and typically we will often run off some of the juice prior to fermentation to try and reduce the potential sugar. Otherwise, you end up with wines which are very, very sweet and very high in alcohol once the fermentation is finished. It's not ideal. We're going to now, I think, go on to the tasting. The first pair of wines that you should taste will be the postscriptum from Quinta Roriz and the Pombal from Quinta Vesuvio. So I suggest if we take those two wines and start with the Pratt and Symington's postscriptum first, and then compare it with the Pombal of Vesuvio. Charles will comment on the first wines.
Well, both these wines were produced from the 2018 vintage, and 2018 was actually a really very good year. There was some fantastic wines made in 18. It was a year which got off to a dry start, dry winter, but then followed by a wet spring, which was well needed, and although always more difficult to handle, it didn't, in fact, bring back the water levels, because 17 had been an exceptionally dry year as well. So basically, spring and the early summer were pretty unsettled, quite cool, unusual for the Douro to be this cool. The whole cycle of the vineyard was delayed. It was quite late, and although in August we then had some more typical weather with heat, and the cycle started to recover, we nevertheless had a pretty late start to the vintage relative to what we've been used to recently. But it was a very balanced ripening period, probably one of the better ones in that respect, and allowing for sugars and acidity to develop side by side in a balanced way. It was a year with pretty low yields, which again, obviously, has always been useful for quality, and a year which I think has got some great acidity. So this wine has been made of the postscriptum is a blend of Touriga Nacional, mainly, 58% Touriga Nacional, which is quite a significant proportion, and about 39% of Touriga Franca. So those two varieties make up almost the entire blend, but a very small quantity of Quinta Roriz, which is also known in Portugal as Aragonés, which is another name for this variety, and in Spain it's known as Tempranillo. So the combination of these varieties, I think this wine was then aged in French oak, 400-litre barrels, which is what we typically use at Roriz. So basically, we try and emphasize the fruit as much as possible. The incorporation of wood is something we're very careful with at Roriz. And yeah, I think essentially because of the Douro varieties are so unique, and the character and the style of wines produced in the Douro is different really to any other wine in the world. It would seem a pity to be sort of basically over-oaking our wines and losing the uniqueness of our varieties in Douro. So very much berry fruits, and this is you can this typical Simacor wine with characteristics more of sort of red berry fruit. But some nice spiciness coming through, very ripe, but balanced and elegant on the nose. In the mouth, this wine is round, but full of structure, and I think the concentration of this wine is very, very good indeed. So the other wine we're tasting, so from further east, but also both these properties are north facing. Into Roriz is a 42-hectare vineyard, mostly north facing, northeast. Vesuvio is a far bigger property. It has about 140 hectares, also predominantly north facing. The difference perhaps being that the altitude change at Vesuvio is significantly more. So although Vesuvio, the property is in the more eastern part of the Douro, we have the possibility of planting vineyards at a higher altitude, which allows us to get balanced fermentation, maturations, and to some extent is a big advantage of having that possibility. This wine again is 50% Riga Franca, 45% Riga Nacional, and 5% of Quinta Amarela, a lesser used variety in the Douro. It brings some lovely spiciness and sort of character to the blend, and has typically been used in the Vesuvio wines over the last 15 years or so. The first year we produced red wines or still wines from Vesuvio was in 2007. So we're now have plenty of experience in doing that, and found the best results often come from the higher lying vineyards. This wine's got some lovely sort of cassis, licorice, dark chocolate, bit of thyme, spicy. Soft but very concentrated. Although this wine drinks very nicely at the moment, it's certainly capable of being aged, and is still quite young. But I think actually a very soft, sweet tannins from a very ripe location. Okay, so I'll pass over to Rupert now to talk about Crisea and Vesuvio 2017. Some really fantastic wines and a really fantastic vintage.
Well, it's really fun to look at the postscriptum against the Pombal. I think you're starting to get some of that difference in character, due to the slightly higher yields, slightly at Roriz, and the hotter character of Vesuvio, and also those red and blue fruits. I was looking forward to coming onto the 2017s. Crisea is a huge personal favorite of mine, but Vesuvio has is a sort of a legend certainly here in Portugal. These two estates are probably considered the two of the absolute sort of gems of the Douro region. They're both estates with enormous histories. Crisea moved to Roriz only in 2009, when we purchased the estate for Prats and Symington. But Roriz, Vesuvio, our first wine from Vesuvio, we made only was the 2007, so it's a relatively newer project. But I think 17s are absolute classics. 2017 was a year where we had, as Charles said, fairly low yields as the 18, but wonderfully balanced maturations of great development. In terms of the Crisea, start off with the Crisea. This was a wine that was 75% Touriga Nacional, which is more, but typically with Cruzea, we've used 50-50 Touriga Nacional and Touriga Franca. This one had 75% Nacional, so you're getting much more of that sort of what Charles described as that sort of rock rose character. Rock rose is a plant, that grows in the Douro, but we're probably very familiar with the taste or the smell, but you're probably less so. But a wine which definitely shows a little bit more evolution than the 18s, a lovely wood finish. The Franca is giving a little bit of that sort of minty character. And I think the essential character of Cruzea comes out in this sort of slightly bacon fat character. And if we compare it with the Vesuvio, Vesuvio has 56% Touriga Franca and 41% Nacional. So it's an inverted proportion. It's got more of the of that varietal, and then about just a little 3% of Amarella in it. I think the wood is perhaps a bit more noticeable. I think the interesting thing here is the cooler sort of redder fruits of Cruzea and the sort of almost the sort of Vesuvio is to me, it's got a sort of almost bouquet garni, garrigue kind of character. It's got that sort of interesting herbal character coming through, and I think that's typical of the Douro Superior, that sort of thyme, pine needles.
I think one of the things that's interesting just to refer to is that when we started making Douro still wines, at the turn of the century, about the first editions we made in 2000, 2001, we really didn't know at the time what we could expect in terms of longevity and aging capacity for these wines. I think one of the things that's been really impressive and something that I don't think any of us actually really thought that it would be so long lived. Perhaps based on our experience of vintage port, we should have been more confident. But nevertheless, it's come as a very pleasant surprise that the early editions of Cruzea, the 2000, the 2001, are wines which are still showing beautifully today, still showing potential to age. And these wines that we're looking at today, these 2017s, from one of the best years in many, the 17s are really fantastic wines. These wines have a potential to age, I would say, comfortably 20 years or more. So a bit like vintage port, I think Douro does offer a tremendous capacity for aging. And I think this Vesuvio is a wine that's got tremendous concentration and structure. I think the two wines are different. The Cruzea is a more elegant style, more freshness. Vesuvio is definitely a wine that is a more sort of powerful, more concentrated wine. So the style is ripe to the point. So two wines from different estates, and obviously they're relatively far apart, these two locations. And it's just worth mentioning as well that at Vesuvio you'd expect about 470 millimeters of rain a year, whereas at Roriz, you'd expect perhaps 100 millimeters more than that. So there's quite a significant difference. It's about 20% more rainfall at Roriz, and considerably, there's probably 3 degrees C in temperature difference, which is also quite significant. Sorry, cutting.
No, thanks for that. I think these are, as I say, 2 of sort of the Douro's kind of stellar reds. They're both. This is a particularly dry year. We produced about 3,200 dozen of the Quinta 17, and only about 2,000 dozen of the Vesuvio 17. So they're quite small productions, we basically we basically sold both these wines out completely. So we're they're just what's left now for the library. But I think both showing extraordinarily well today, and really fun to taste these 2 side by side. We do, as Charles mentioned, we use really exclusively 400-litre barrels for the Quinta. Vesuvio, we do mix a little bit of the classic smaller 225 or 250-litre barrels, 225 I think they are. But by the way, a port pipe is typically 534 litres for the what's called a shipping pipe, and 550 litres in the Douro. So if you look at the history of the port trade, there was 550 litres is now the most common Douro pipe, and then a shipping pipe was 534. But I think the measure that is probably most useful is 550. There was even a pipe at Silver & Cousins had a lodge pipe which was 537.5, but you don't need to know about that. Good. Well, I think we'll probably move on to the 2 ports, which last but not least, and again starting with the Quinta de Roriz, and then on the left, and then compare it with the Quinta de Vesuvio on the right. Charles, would you like to talk a little bit about 2007? I'm sure you remember it very well from the other wines that you made.
Absolutely. Well, 2007 was a rather unusual year for the Douro, in so much that it was probably, of all the vintages I've done, probably one of the coolest years, and the vintage itself. We had fantastic weather throughout the vintage, but it was much cooler than as usual. And I think it's actually a year that I particularly enjoyed. I enjoyed working in cooler conditions. It's certainly a lot easier, and it certainly brought about a much slower, much more gradual ripening period, bringing about wines as you would expect, with better acidity, fantastic aromas, and very balanced wines. It was a declared vintage year. Not that that's necessarily particularly relevant at this point, because Vesuvio and Roriz are estate wines that are produced every year. But nevertheless, it was probably one of the best years of the century so far. We were fortunate enough to have produced a 100-point wine in the Wine Spectator in 2007, just to give you an indication of how good this year was. And so these wines, both of them, in fact, and becoming fairly rare these days, actually, both of these wines are produced foot-trodden in lagares at the Quinta. Vesuvio has some of the most impressive lagares in the region, being trodden by 40 people for 3 hours every night. And this process is a process that basically is very effective in taking structure and colour from grapes due to the very short fermentation period that we have in port. So whereas the wines that we've just been tasting previous to this would have had fermentation periods of about 10 days and maceration on the skins, quite often up to another 10 days. In this case, we're looking at wines produced for a fermentation period of not much more than 48 hours. So the time of contact between the skins and must is very short, and the treading process is a method which allows us to extract the structure and the colour that will allow these wines then to age for many, many years to come. I was very fortunate very recently at the factory house to be drinking a vintage port from 1927, which was one of the most fantastic ports I've ever had, which is a Douro 27. So it just shows how this process of producing, which is probably the Romans and even previous to them were making wines under similar conditions, but a very simple method can produce the most extraordinary wines. So here we have wines, and you can, I mean, if you bear in mind what I've just said, and you look at the colour of these wines, I mean, these wines are already 13, 14 years old, and still full of colour. The Roriz, with lovely sort of berry fruit, cigar box starting to come through quite clearly, in fact, and bit of tobacco, spicy. So showing very nicely on the nose. Gone through its teenage phase, so to speak, and it is opening up into a sort of more mature vintage now.
I think that the note probably on the Vesuvio is more of the Garrigue, but I'm getting a lot of that sort of cherry stone on the Crozet, on the Roriz, which is I think a character I pick up a lot on the ports from Quinta Roriz, is that sort of black cherry, and that the wood is perfectly integrated. It's beautiful. The Cima Corvo is probably the classic. The great ports have always been produced, I would say, from the central Douro. You've got names like Quinta de Noval, Fonseca, Graham, coming from not too far away from the Douros, not too far away from Roriz, whereas the Vesuvio is more of an outlier. The Douro Superior has always had its contribution to great vintage port, but it's I think all the greatest names have always been in the Cima Corvo and not the Douro Superior. Vesuvio being a relative exception.
So the Vesuvio wine is a bit sweeter than the Roriz wine. So as you'd expect, coming from a slightly warmer part of the Douro, your initial sugar in the must is usually higher than at Roriz, so we have higher sugar levels. So we fortify also at a higher level, giving wines overall sweeter, but nevertheless in balance and great acidity in this wine. This wine's got some lovely floral aromas. There's eucalyptus coming through as well. So slightly eucalyptus minty aromas from the aging as well. In the mouth, still pretty young, still pretty structured, pretty big, but the tannins and the And the Vesuvio wines are typically velvety, quite soft, and that comes through here very clearly as well. So I think on this,
I think we should now move on to questions. I'm sure that there's some probably interesting questions out there, and we've done an hour, and obviously we've got some time for Q&A. So please, if we could, I'm not sure if our hosts could throw the.
I'll read a few out if that's okay. First question here from Sean Adams. He's asking why there's less of a focus on Quinta de Roriz for the PNS DOC wines in comparison to the Quinta de Vesuvio wines, which carry that name on the label.
This is really, I think we came out with Crisea before we had the Quinta de Roriz as a contributor to the name. So we had actually, when Charles Symington bought Quinta de Roriz, there was a Quinta de Roriz Reserva produced, but obviously it was at a slightly lower price, and we have, if you look at the Crisea label, the Quinta de Roriz does appear there on the label, but Crisea was always a non-vineyard specific. Crisea draws from a couple of other estates, Quinta de Villa, Quinta de Roriz, and prior to that, it actually grew also some wild grapes from Quinta de Vesuvio. So we've kept Crisea. I think the market likes the idea of a name rather than an estate. But you may see that as we've replanted Quinta de Roriz over the intervening years, you may see Quinta de Roriz becoming a bit more prominent on that label in years to come.
Good. Gianluca has asked what the respective fermentation temperatures for ports and dry still wines are.
That's one for Charles.
Well, I mean, temperatures of fermentation will always depend, independently of whether it's port or table wine, will depend first and foremost on the level of ripeness, the initial sugar readings, and obviously, what our end goal is in terms of that particular ferment. But on the whole, due to the fermentation of port being very short and our extraction being needing to be quite considerable in that period of time, we will be fermenting. Our lagage will peak at about 30 degrees C, sometimes even slightly above that. So we'll be fermenting at quite a lot higher temperatures. Our table wines, if you were to take a sort of average figure, you might be talking about 26 degrees C ferment. But like I say, it will depend to an extent on the variety, on the year, and obviously on what the objective is for that particular ferment.
Thanks. Another question from John. Can you talk about how you make the selections for postscriptum as opposed to Crisea?
I could probably take that one. I think Crisea started in the first, postscriptum started, first time we made postscriptum was in 2002, when we basically didn't feel we had wine that was quite good enough to be Crisea, so we basically created a second wine and sold the Crisea in 2002 as postscriptum. From then on, we actually made a postscriptum, I think from 2004 onwards, alongside Crisea. And about half of postscriptum is wine that is basically made to be Crisea, and then probably is selected, not selected at the 11th hour to be part of the lot. The other half we make now, so that goes into new French oak barrels. It's made with all the care and attention that we make Crisea, goes into Crisea. The other half of it now probably is wine that we make specifically, and a lot of it is drawn from younger plantings at Quinta de Perdige, which is a retortal property owned by Rupert Symington just over the hill from Roriz, and from the Roriz plantings that we feel are probably secondary, like the Baroccas and mixed plantings at Roriz. So we do have we have a sort of a proportion of postscriptum, which is sort of made as a second wine, and another proportion that is made specifically to be a big beefy Douro red that probably doesn't have quite the finesse to go into the top blend.
Thanks. From Kyle Holmes, can you tell us a little bit more about Vinha Velha and what the requirements are in the Douro for being considered an old vine?
Well, the legislation on Vinha Velhas is actually recently been adapted or changed, and now for a vineyard, for a wine to be known as Vinha Velhas, and this is not fully implemented yet. It will be implemented at this next vintage for the first time. The vineyards will need to be 40 years old, and with specific densities of plantation, specific methods of planting themselves. So really respecting the traditions of the Douro, and requiring clear evidence that the vineyards are of that age. The yields per hectare may not be more than 2.5 tons per hectare, which is, again, we're talking, that's considerably less than 1 kilo per vine. You're probably talking about 800 grams per vine. So that is currently the requirements for old vineyards field blends on the Douro. And it must be a field blend to resolve.
Thanks, Charles. Question from Keith Matrick. Are there soil variations moving from the Cima Corgo to the Douro Superior, or are they mainly climatic and altitude driven? You had mentioned acidity falling as you moved upriver, but I imagine you were referring to acidity of the must and wines and not the soils.
We were referring to the soils. That the soils are slightly more alkaline as you move up the river. There's a big seam of pure granite which cuts the Douro in two, round about the Caixão de Baleiro dam, which is the dam that divides the Douro Superior from the Cima Corgo. And the soil pH is slightly lower below the dam than it is above the dam. I cite that if you grow hydrangeas at Vesuvio, they are blue, and if you grow them at Malverdes below the dam, they are pink or pinky blue. So there is a sort of the hydrangea is like litmus paper. It does pick up changes in the acidity of the soil. So we were referring to the soil content. Other changes in the soil, it's basically the same schist lying on granite. There's no material difference in the soil composition between the two regions.
Thanks, Rupert. From Cassandra McPherson, I was reading about port declarations and Weldon Fine Wine noted ahead of the traditional St. George's Day date for declarations favoured by the British port houses. Can you speak to that date, and is that a date Symington typically announces its declarations?
I think that's there's a heavy emphasis on another port house here that has always used St. George's Day. We don't use St. George's Day because other people use it. It's a good, roughly, I think it's the 23rd of April. It's a good date to declare. We believe it's a very good time to be assessing the quality of our vintage ports. we leave the wines 2 winters in the wood. We then have to have them approved by the IVDP in the spring, and we would certainly, it's a lot of work to get everything together and get samples together in time for the declaration date. So we would think any time from the beginning of April is a good time to do that.
I think the plan is for the next few years to have that declaration on April 14th going forwards. Here's a question from Adam Odo. What are your biggest challenges in winemaking in the Douro?
Well, there's certainly a lot of challenges. I think the biggest challenges of, if you like, winemaking as a whole in the Douro is definitely the viticulture. The viticulture is incredibly on the limit of what is possible in farming anything anywhere in the world, I would say. And therefore, between the opening of terraces and the removal of stone, just to create the structure on which you will then plant in the Douro is a massive operation, hugely expensive. And then running and dealing with mountainside vineyards when you get a storm and the rain, the collapsing of terraces can happen. All of the sort of difficulties of farming in the Douro are huge. From a winemaking perspective, I think on the whole we're rather lucky because we have good weather conditions. Generally speaking, we tend to have useful weather at the vintage, making it fairly straightforward. Obviously, that's not always true, and we can get 1 or 2 more difficult years. And due to the fact that the yields in our vineyards are so low, our wines tend to be naturally very concentrated, full of colour. Perhaps the principal difficulty from a still wine making point of view is having quite high alcohol levels or high sugar levels, which will give rise to high alcohol, obviously. And so that managing that aspect is often a challenge to try and get the balance right between the level of ripeness and the level of acidity, and getting the 2 things side by side. I think the other big challenge we have is a noticeable change in the climate that we've seen over the last 30 or 40 years. Adapting to that change, we've planted, like a vineyard library where the Douro has over 100 different varieties, and we're now looking to select varieties that may be more resistant, more adapted to the conditions that we're seeing today. So those are definitely challenges that we're looking to overcome and focusing on.
Thank you, Charles. Randy Steinloff has a question. Can you speak to the importance of the quality of the aguardiente used in port production and how you source yours?
Yeah, I mean, brandy is very much an important aspect to the port making, but it's basically what we're trying to do is to produce a wine that shows the characteristics of the vineyard where it's from. So, like we're looking at today, terroir wines from Vesuvio, Roriz, the character of those wines. So certainly, our winemaking philosophy in that respect is based on using brandies that are clean, they're vinous, but influence really as little as possible the end result of the wine. So, we're not in the business of making liqueurs. We're basically in the business of making a wine which is a reflection of the location where it comes from. So really looking to use brandies that are fairly quiet, but clean. No tops and tails from distillation, but ensuring a high quality of brandy, but also with not very much aroma to it, fairly inert to the point. Yeah.
Thank you, Charles. A question from Julia Hofsas. What determines your decision to make a vintage port versus a multi-vintage or non-vintage port?
Well, I'll take that. I mean, I think there's two questions there. There's which are the years that that are worthy of classic vintage, and then there's what to do with all the wines that we make each year. Charles will make, let's take Graham, for example. Charles will make something like 60 different fermentations at Graham each vintage, each year. And then we'll assess those 60 lots will be kept separate in separate tanks, small tanks, each representing one fermentation. And then long after the vintage, probably a couple of months or 3 or 4 months after the vintage, out of the stress and into relative calm of the sample run, those ones will be classified according to how good they are. The very best 10 lots would be kept for potential vintage or single Quinta wines. The next 20 would probably be kept for something like 6 grapes, and so on. So that's the assessment process. And you've got to remember that the 40 or 60 lots made by Graham are all from our top estate, so they're all going to be pretty damn good wines to start with. And often it's difficult, to know what to do with them, and probably a lot of wines end up getting declassified unnecessarily just because we don't have a market for, a big enough market for our top wines. The other question is, which are the years that are going to make classic vintage ports? And I'm not sure if that was part of the question, but I'm going to answer it anyway. Obviously, the good thing about the Douro, no 2 years are the same. We get extreme weather conditions coming in over this Moran mountain range, different levels of precipitation, different temperature variations during the year, and with 6 different varietals, each responding differently to those climatic variations, we have a very different end result each vintage. Every vintage is different in terms of what grapes taste like, what the weather conditions have been like, yields, etc. So we assess the quality at the end of the vintage, the wines that we've made. We have the luxury of being able to wait 2 years before we have to declare. So we've always got 2 consecutive years in tank before we decide to bottle one as vintage or non-vintage. So we've got a lot of time to decide and a lot of time to assess and put aside the best wines. But the end result, the top prize is when we have a wine worthy of declaring as a classic Graham's or a classic Dow's, and that only happens once every 3-4 years, so not very often. I hope that answers some of the question anyway.
Thanks. Could you just add to that real quick? Someone's asking about a personal 3 favorite vintage ports or vintage years.
Well, it's very easy. 1927, from what we had last week. 1963, I would say, is a personal favorite, and 1994 is another personal favorite. But Charles can give his top 3.
Well, I'd add to that for sure 1945 and 1970. Those 2 years are fantastic vintages as well, particularly the Graham 70 wine I served at my wedding. It was a rather long time ago now, but nevertheless, the wine is still very good. 2011, I think, is a year that is going to join that long list.
The Pantheon.
Yeah.
Question from Bruno Almeida. A lot of other wine regions in the world are kind of focusing down on sub-regions and putting those smaller crew names on their bottles. How do you think regions like Pinhão or Tour do you think they'll play a role in the future of Douro wines and vintage ports?
My own theory, I think it's a very good question, is that the Douro is too big to be a single region. We should have sub-classifications, and I think it would benefit the consumer of Douro wines and ports to understand better where they came from. Politically, it's a very tough decision because there will be sheep and there will be goats in the process. But I think in terms of understanding terroirs. I would prefer to see regions like Rio Torto, even villages would make a lot more sense than having three, administrative districts like the Simacorgo, the Baixo and the Douro Superior, which I think don't really mean anything. But that's my own opinion. I mean, Charles may disagree.
Yeah, I think it would make some sense. Also, bearing in mind that there's a lot of vineyard at 500-600 meters of altitude, for instance, in the Douro Superior, and in the Baixo and the difference between vineyards at that altitude to vineyards down by the river is also very relevant. And it's not a question of being better or worse. It's just clearly, different locations are going to have very different profiles of wines. And that, if that was more evident on a label, I think that would only be a good thing.
Thank you. Another question from Cassandra. The 1882 magazine mentions, our company has been clear in calling for reform of the outdated quota system for port grapes that has been negatively affecting the prices farmers receive for grapes they sell for Douro wines. She's hoping that you might be able to elaborate more on this and what you might be interested in as far as new regulatory systems.
Well, I wish I could disclose. I spend many hours each week thinking and debating with other port shippers and wine producers what could be done. Again, it's a big political hot potato because the main number of voters in the Douro live in places where there are higher yields and probably on average lower quality wines. So it's very difficult to persuade people to have change where they feel that they might possibly lose out as a result of that change. But in terms of what's necessary, it's clear that the price paid for the grapes that don't go into port is too low, and we want to make sure that price goes up, not just by Symington paying more for grapes and everyone else paying less, but there needs to be a system where there is a more equalization between the price paid for port grapes, which is about €1,000 a pipe of 550, and table wine grapes or Douro DOC grapes, which is more like 400, 450 euros per 550 litres. And that for grapes which are effectively identical in growing costs, it's not really sustainable to have a difference that's so great. There may always have to be a difference, but it's not an easy thing to solve. And I believe that whole governments will have to come and go before it gets solved, but it needs to be solved.
Thanks. Similar question from Bruno, same area. How challenging has labour been mainly in the last 2 years?
How challenging has it been to get labour? Well, I mean, oddly enough, recessions create more availability of labour, and in fact, it was more difficult to get labour back in 2005, 6, 7, before the last financial crisis. Things were getting quite complicated a couple of years ago, but I'm afraid with COVID and due to mainly the very significant reduction in tourism in Portugal, which employs obviously a lot of people. At this moment in time, we are in fact in a situation where it's easier to get labour than it has been for some time. But nevertheless, it's certainly quite obvious that in the future it's going to become considerably more difficult.
Thanks. Only a couple more questions here. Bruno asks again, vintage port can be fairly challenging at times for some regarding service. Glassware, temperature, cellaring, storage, and pairing. What's your take on all of that? How to serve it?
Well, I think we just make the wine that is most difficult, A, to taste, B, to age, because it just takes so long, and C, to actually decant and prepare. But it's worth it. I mean, there's no doubt that it's worth it. It is difficult to deal with. Luckily, port has a very heavy sediment, so I'm an arbitrator now or an advocate rather of free decanting, free pouring. If I open a bottle of 94 Wars in the Douro, I'll just pour it straight from the bottle, and it pours clean. There's no problem at all. I wouldn't do that in a restaurant, but I would do it at home. So.
The last question, $1 million question. As Somms, how can we better sell port on the floor? What are we missing to get people to order and enjoy more?
I think it's putting it in people's mouths. People have this sort of, received problem with wines that are sweet and wines that are difficult to deal with. And I think it just, to me, the secret is by the glass pouring and not having a by the glass bottle that's been on the shelf for a week. Open a bottle on the night, sell 8 or 10 clean glasses out of that bottle as a special, and people will just thank you for it. It's a magical combination, freshly decanted vintage port, from a good producer, a good year. It's worth a hell of a lot more than you pay for that glass. I mean, it really is a great experience in a restaurant.
Randy's sent through a question here. Obviously, a vintage port is best enjoyed after decades of aging, but what are your thoughts about drinking vintage ports young?
I think I'm going to answer that one as well. I think it's a question of taste. We've all got used to enjoying wine younger. Most wine regions are selling a much higher proportion of young wine than old wine. In fact, it's very difficult to find old wine anymore. Vintage port, more than about 20 years old, used to be, quite easy to find in London. Now you can't find it for a lot of money. So it's a question of changing tastes. I personally love a beautiful young vintage port. But then again, I also love on a different night a bottle of 25-year-old cellar matured vintage port. So it's a question of taste. There's no perfect answer to that question. But I do realize that the time is rolling on, and I would like to sincerely thank the SommFoundation for this amazing opportunity to showcase 2 of the Douro's classic estates. Coincidentally, about 25 years ago, a young journalist, Wine Spectator, wrote a piece in the magazine about 2 Douro estates that were emerging as classic single producers, and they happen to be the 2 that we're tasting tonight, or this afternoon in your case. I'm so honored and proud to be the owner or part owner of these 2 estates. They are 2 iconic Douro properties, and I think they, better than any other 2 properties, they do show what we're trying to set out to do, the differences between terroir in the Douro and also the way that the varietals respond to the different weather conditions. So it's been a really fun hour and a half for us, for Charles and I, as well as I hope for you. We'd love to do this again, but I'm sure we won't be allowed to for at least another 20 years. But we hope you've enjoyed it as much as we have. And thank you.
Thank you.